All right, so this is the second video for the metabolism chapter. So the first thing we're going to go through is a recap from the last video, okay? So we'll go through each of the steps, what that step starts with, and what products you get at the end. And then we're going to go through metabolism of things that are not glucose, so fats and proteins, and how those are used for energy. Okay, so for our recap, all right, the first step is glycolysis. Remember, this step occurs in the cytoplasm. And so we're going to start glycolysis with a glucose. We're going to end up with our 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATP, and 2 NADH. Okay, so remember, each of these pyruvic acids is essentially, it's a 3-carbon molecule, so half of our glucose. All right, and so then we're going to take that pyruvic acid and put it into our next step, so the formation of acetyl Coa. So with this process, we are going to remove one of those carbons from the pyruvic acid and get rid of it as CO2. We're also going to form 2 NADH, and then we're going to end up with 2 acetyl CoAs, right? And so CoA was our coenzyme. Okay, and so that coenzyme A is going to carry the acetyl to this next step, all right, our Krebs cycle. Our Krebs cycle is occurring in the matrix of the mitochondria. And so with that process, we're going to take our 2 acetyl CoAs, break them down into 4 carbon dioxides, which are going to be exhaled, 2 ATPs, nope, that is our final total, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2. Okay? And so then if we kind of put together all of the NADH that we made, so we have 2 here, 2 here, 6 here, that'll be 10 that we're starting our electron transport chain with, and then our 2 FADH2, and then we absolutely need oxygen to receive that hydrogen at the end of the electron transport chain. All right, and so the products of the electron transport chain are going to be water because of the hydrogen and oxygen, and 34 ATP. And also, don't forget that you also make a lot of heat, all right, through aerobic respiration. And so that's actually why when you're exercising or you're being really active, you start sweating a lot, is because you're making more ATP and generating more heat in that process. Okay? And so then we can add that for our final total, that 34 ATP to the 4 that we made in the previous process to give us a total of 38. All right, so 38 ATP total. Okay? All right. So 2 kind of terms that I want to add in now that we've gone through all the processes are one, which is chemiosmosis. So this is just the movement of hydrogen that ends up creating water. Okay, and so that's actually this last process where that hydrogen moves through that ATPase and then is caught at the end by oxygen and makes water. That is chemiosmosis. And then oxidative phosphorylation is just referring to the process that oxidation of NADH or our FADH2 makes ATP. And so the phosphorylation part comes in with the ATP because we are taking adenosine diphosphate, right, which has 2 phosphates on it, and we're adding another phosphate to it. Adding a phosphate to something is just called phosphorylation. All right, so we're oxidating oxidizing really, right, our NADH, and we're phosphorylating our ADP to make ATP. So oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so let's talk about using other molecules for energy. All right, and so what's going to happen with these, so our fats and our amino acids, is that we are going to be able to convert the monomers of these molecules into some component in a step of that process we talked about. Okay, so let's talk about each and kind of what step it can be used in. So if we take our triglyceride, right, which is what this is, it's made up of our glycerol backbone here, right, and then we have our 3 fatty acid tails here. Okay, so we're going to first focus on our fatty acids. All right, so I'll just kind of box in this guy is what we're focused on first. Okay, so our fatty acids, and typically they're much, much larger than this, right? They're very, very, very long. It's just this extremely long chain of carbons with little hydrogens attached to them. That's what a fatty acid is. Okay, and so what we can do to use these for energy, because you know that you can burn fat for energy, and fat will actually provide a lot of energy, is we can take these fatty acid chains and we can break them down into 2 carbon pieces. All right, so essentially, let's do, right, so we would break this down, so 2 carbons, 2 carbons, 2 carbons, right, just like that. So break it up into these 2 carbon chunks, which, if you remember from our cellular respiration, our 2 carbon molecule is an acetyl. Okay, so that 2 carbon chunks can be converted to acetyls. Those acetyls can be attached to a CoA, all right, giving you acetyl CoAs. Okay, and so that, let's just kind of highlight these parts, right? Acetyl CoAs. So we know that those acetyl CoAs can go into, if we look back up here, our Krebs cycle, right? So we can just pop them right there into the Krebs cycle. They can go through, make 6 NADH each, 2 FADH2s each, and then those can go into the electron transport chain and make ATP. Okay, so we can use those to directly make ATP. However, because you get so many of these 2 carbon chunks from one triglyceride, because remember, these are going to be much, much longer, right? And then there's 3 of them in each triglyceride. You're going to end up with a lot of extra acetyl CoAs. Okay, so you need to do something with those acetyl CoAs. A lot of them will end up being, waste products, but what they are converted to is a ketone. Okay, and so I'm sure you guys have heard of ketones before. The keto diet is very popular right now, and those ketones are essentially waste products that are gotten rid of in the urine. Okay, so a lot of people, as a means of measuring how successful their dieting is, will measure the amount of ketones in their urine. And that's just essentially, the more ketones you have, the more fat your body is burning for energy. So that's kind of one way to measure your dieting success. Okay. However, also ketones are actually used by, if needed, right? They can be used by the heart and the brain for energy. Okay, so if you are burning fats for energy, that means there's not a lot of glucose available. All right, your body will next go to fat as its source for energy, and so your brain can actually use those ketones for energy, and so can your heart. All right, so one thing to also consider though is that ketones make the blood acidic. Okay, so if you are burning a lot of fat, all right, a significant amount, essentially you're not getting any carbohydrates at all, you can make a lot of ketones, and that can make your blood very acidic, and that can be extremely dangerous. So this is actually a danger for diabetics. All right, so with diabetics, they have the problem where glucose can't actually get into their cells. So even if they're eating carbohydrates, right, without that insulin, the body cells can't use it. So they're going to be burning fat. Okay, so they're going to be producing a lot of ketones, and if they're not regulating, their insulin levels or their blood sugar, they can have problems with ketoacidosis, and that could actually be very dangerous. They could end up going into a coma because of it. Okay. All right, good. So that is the fatty acid part. So now let's look at our glycerol here. Okay. So our glycerol is going to be the backbone part, all right? And as we can see, it's made up of 3 carbons, okay? And so our other 3 carbon molecules that we have in cellular respiration were pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Remember, in glycolysis, we essentially cut our glucose in half and ended up with 2 pyruvates. Then we could, if we look up here in our kind of condensed steps, we can take those pyruvates, use them in the formation of acetyl Coa, and just proceed all the way through the rest of the steps to make ATP. However, don't forget that this step, glycolysis, is reversible, okay? So glycolysis is reversible, so we can use glycerol to make pyruvate and then ATP, or we can take that pyruvate and convert it and make it into glucose. Okay, so we can use that to make glucose. All right. And so with this process of using our fats for energy, right, we're using both beta oxidation, which is converting those fatty acids to those acetyl CoAs, right, breaking down those fatty acids to acetyl CoAs. That's called beta oxidation. And with the glycerol part, right, we're performing gluconeogenesis. Okay, so this is just the process of making glucose from something that's not a carbohydrate. So in this case, a fat. All right, so neo meaning new. So it's like we're genesis, making a brand new glucose from something that wasn't sugar before. Okay, gluconeogenesis. All right. Now, how do we use proteins for energy? Okay, so protein metabolism. So our proteins are going to be broken down into amino acids. So then those amino acids can be used as the energy source. All right, so just a reminder of a couple parts of our amino acids. So we have up here, right, our variable region. Okay, so this variable region is the part of the amino acid that is different, all right? Between every single amino acid, it's different, and this is actually the part that will determine if that amino acid can be used for this process of making ATP. Some variable regions are very simple, right? Some of them just have a hydrogen, right? Or maybe, an oxygen and like an OH group, all right? Those could very easily be used for energy. However, there are some amino acids with very complex variable regions that cannot be used in this process. Okay, and so that all depends on this variable region. All right, and then we have this part here. Whoops, there we go. Let's try that again. All right, this is called the amine group. Okay, so this amine group, this is the nitrogen containing group. And so in order to use an amino acid for energy, first we have to remove this nitrogen. Okay, and that's why in the beginning of this chapter we talked about nitrogen balance. All right, and so when you're breaking down amino acids, you're creating more nitrogen waste. That's because of this process of removing the nitrogen. And so that process is called deamination, right? You're removing the amine group, deamination. So we remove that amine group, it's converted into ammonia, all right, and then to urea. This occurs in the liver. Whoops. Okay, and then that urea can be removed as a waste product. And we definitely want to remove it because ammonia is very basic, right? And it will increase the pH of the blood as it builds up. Okay, so the more nitrogen waste you have, the more alkalotic the blood will become. So you definitely want to remove that as a waste product. Okay, and so then it's removed in the urine. Okay, so now we've removed that amine group. Now we're left with 1, 2, 3 carbons. Okay, just like we had in our glycerol, right? We can take that 3 carbon region of our amino acid, convert it into pyruvate, and then just like with glycerol, that pyruvate can be used to make ATP, or it can be used to make glucose. That would be gluconeogenesis. All right, so we can go to making glucose or ATP. Okay, good. Then our last 2 kind of topics for this chapter are going to be the kind of states of metabolism that occur after you eat. Okay, so our first state is the absorptive state, and that's followed by the post-absorptive state. So you should just be familiar with what happens in each of these kind of phases. All right, so the absorptive state is the first one right after you eat. It lasts for about 4 hours after you've eaten. This process, your food is being digested, those nutrients are being absorbed, and generally they're going to be stored because you're going to have a lot of nutrients being absorbed. Okay, so processes occurring during the absorptive state are going to be glycogenesis, so taking glucose and converting it into glycogen, because remember, we're storing nutrients. All right, and so we store glucose in the form of glycogen. At this stage, insulin would be very active because those body cells need to be able to take up that glucose in order to convert it into glycogen. Lipogenesis, so we would be taking in this state our monoglycerides and our fatty acids, putting them back together to form triglycerides. Right? Triglycerides are the form that you store fats in. And protein anabolism, so we'd be taking amino acids and making proteins from them. Right? And then lastly, we have our post-absorptive state. So this would be after that 4-hour period from our absorptive state. All right, so we've absorbed all the nutrients, we've stored them, and now we're at the point where we're going to need to start using those stored nutrients for energy. Okay, so we're going to kind of just reverse basically everything we just did. So here we would have glycogenolysis occurring, so breaking down that glycogen to glucose so we can get the glucose from it. We are going to break down our triglycerides, that's lipolysis. As we talked about just a second ago, we can break it down to fatty acids, and those can be used to make acetyl CoAs, and that can be made into ATP. Don't forget that the extras are converted to ketones. Okay, and then the glycerol can be made into pyruvate, which can make ATP or glucose. Then our proteins are broken down into amino acids. That would be catabolism. And those amino acids can be converted into pyruvate. All right, that is after they have been deaminated. All right, we remove that amine, and then that pyruvate can be used to make ATP or glucose. Okay, and then lastly, in this post-absorptive state, something called glucose sparing is extremely important. And so glucose sparing is just reserving glucose for brain function. Okay, so brain function is obviously critical for all other life functions. And so when glucose levels are lower during this post-absorptive state, what will happen is your body will switch all the other organs over to using fats and proteins for energy, because your brain has to have glucose, right? It doesn't use those other sources of energy. It can use some ketones, but it has to have glucose for energy, okay? Because those neurons are very particular. So your body will switch over all the other organs to carbohydrates or to fats and proteins so that the glucose can be sent to the brain, okay? All right, so that's the metabolism chapter. For the process of aerobic respiration, I would recommend going through it, writing it out a bunch of times, practice it. I would try to write out this process, right, this recap, over and over until you can do it without looking at your notes at all. And that'll help you a lot when you're studying.